Welcome to this second film on working with organisational culture. In the first film, we looked at what culture is, how it's formed, and also why it might need to be addressed. In this second film, we look at how we actually approach working with clients on culture in terms of the key steps or the key phases, and also some of the tools and methodologies to be used. Andrew, how much of the work can be planned and how much emerges?
Well, I think there needs to be a combination of having a planned, a relatively structured approach to the work with allowing space for emergence. I mean, philosophically, what change has to be emergent if something creative is going to happen, because, creativity cannot be thought about in advance. And at the same time, for people to be creative, they need to have some form of structure and some boundaries in place that give them some sense of purpose, direction, that they know broadly what's going to happen and when. And in the absence of that, in my experience, clients become, or employees become too anxious to be able to take risk and to experiment.
So Adrian, talk more about the phases of work involved.
Well, the first phase, I think, was about articulating intent. The chief executive had some very sort of simple but important, what we would call radial threads, sort of prime principles. Inclusion, wanted to include as many people. He wanted high participation. He wanted it to be a kind of grown-up organization. He wanted to move away from a parent-child model of organizations where the senior managers do all the thinking and then try and sell their ideas and control people. He wanted to have kind of distributed responsibility and leadership throughout the organization. So that was the first phase. The second phase was attending to the different cultures and comparing and contrasting them and supporting the conversation about that. The third phase was then taking that back into some of the more formal settings, the conference. And then the final phase was really about consolidating, clarifying the emerging agreement and understanding and specific actions that fell out of that and getting on with it, really. Some people find the process of appreciative inquiry helpful because it has stages. The first part is discovery, the second part is what are our strengths, what is our culture? The second phase is dreaming, what is the future we would like to create together? The third phase is design, how do we make this happen, what does it mean practically? And the fourth phase is delivery, or sometimes termed destiny, 4 Ds.
The process we had would be, so we say, is we start to make some sense of the patterns, inquire into them, understand them, and in some ways allow the organisation, enable the organisation to then make sense of whether these patterns were helpful or unhelpful.
One of the ways of really understanding culture is through the stories that employees tell.
Spent 2 days sifting through all of the stories and summarised them through imagery, through a picture. We had a graphic artist help us to represent these stories in images. And in one organisation, the core image was of a ship, and the other organisation, the core image was of a shoal of fish that sort of were swimming together. And those representations really resonated with people in the organisation, and we suddenly discovered that, well beyond our awareness, they kind of were sent throughout this organisation. 60,000 people were suddenly looking at these pictures and having conversations with each other about what's similar, what's different, what do we like about your picture, your culture, and what do we admire about how can we work with both, and what do we need to pay attention to in trying to create something together.
The most creative stuff that we've done is around mergers of using social media to enable conversations to take place between 2 companies that are coming together in a merger involving several, kind of 20,000 people.
We used a website that was hosting a conversation. It was called the Culture Square. And the idea of it was to give everyone in this organisation, 60,000 people, a chance to join the conversation. So if we think of the Culture Square as a kind of conversation, it's like a giant water cooler conversation. Okay, it was an informal conversation that happens in all organizations all the time. It's just that it was on a much larger scale. What happened is that the senior management team and the OD facilitator who was leading all of this, the internal guy, they wanted to have a formal conference, a 3-day conference, to talk about sort of broader issues, certainly cultural issues, but other issues in the organization. So they hosted this 72-hour conference, which is called a JAM. It's an IBM platform.
How do we move from understanding current cultures to experimentation and change?
Well, I think quite often the experiments we're encouraging clients to develop are small groups of individuals drawn from across the organisation, maybe a microcosm, maybe individuals within one subsystem of the organisation. And as consultants, we work with those groups to help them think about, well, what are some of the patterns that you want to interrupt? But then hold them in a kind of creative place for a sufficient time for them not to simply reproduce, what the culture usually reproduces. So quite often with clients, you also, if you go to action planning too quickly, what they tend to do is go to actions that actually reinforce the existing culture.
You use rapid prototyping a lot in disrupting current patterns of working. Say more about this process.
Rapid prototyping is a sort of a form of experimentation. It's a way that designers might create new products. So, for example, IDEO, one of the most famous design agencies in the world who created the mouse and things like that, they have a particular methodology and a belief system, which is that if you can do something to reduce hierarchy and the effect of power differential, which tends to limit experimentation and limit innovation and change, if reducing power differential and bringing into a collection of people, non-experts, deliberately non-experts, and then follow some creative routines, a sort of rapid prototyping routine, you can generate novel products. What we've done is taken those ideas, combined them with ideas from improvisation, from AI, from other culture ideas, and created a way of effectively prototyping cultures rather than products.
So in our work with organisations, there are programmes that can be planned, but an awful lot of the work is going to be emergent. We try to employ creative techniques to understand cultures, to help people articulate those cultures, and then to experiment and make change and form new patterns. In the next film, we're going to be looking at the role of leaders in helping to form cultures, but also in sponsoring and supporting programmes of change.